All right, we're going to check out three amendments that made changes to the presidential election process. For each, I included the date in which they were officially ratified. And I also included the actual text of the amendment, which you'll notice is very difficult in some circumstances to understand, but it's good practice for you to read something that is a little bit more difficultly worded and to try and figure out or decipher meaning. So by all means, try to read the amendment, pause the video while you're doing that, and then check to see how close you were in terms of like what you like thought it meant. So the First Amendment that we're going to review is the 12th Amendment. This really made changes to the way in which the vice president was selected. The old method before 1804 was that the first place finisher in a presidential election obviously became president, but the second place finisher became vice president. And you get away with this when the Constitution was written because there were no formal political parties. But the parties first formed during Washington's presidency, and then by 1800, they're strong and going. So people recognize that you set up a system in which you were going to have a president of one party and almost always a vice president of another. They thought that'd be too messy. So that was changed. The 12th Amendment establishes what we have today, which is sort of like the team versus team kind of concept, where a president and vice president from one party are running against a president and vice president from another. A vote for one party's president is a vote for their vice president too, ensuring that you're going to have a president and vice president of the same party. The next amendment we're going to look at is the 20th Amendment, which was ratified in 1933. Though we're looking at this through the context of the presidency, this also affects Congress too. So pre 1933, election day has always been in November, but presidents would be elected in November, but then they wouldn't take over until March. So there was that sort of awkward gap between November and March, especially if a president was running for re-election and they lost. Like they would still be there from November to March until the newly elected president took over. It was decided that was way too much of a gap, like from November to March. So the 20th Amendment moved it up so that you'd still have election day in November, but the new person would start like in January. There's less of that awkward gap between when somebody's elected and when they actually take over the job and start doing it. Again, we're looking at this like through the eyes of the presidency, but it's the same thing for Congress. They used to be elected in November and they wouldn't take over until March, and now like the president, they're elected in November and they take over in January. And the last one we're going to look at is the 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951. Before 1951, there were no actual formal limits or rules that prevented presidents from being elected more than two times. Up until FDR, President Roosevelt, there was this sort of like unofficial rule that was established by Washington that it was bad form to run for more than two terms. But there was no rule that prevented that. Roosevelt sort of ignored the tradition and actually ran and was elected successfully four different times. Once he was elected four different times, it became clear to people that if they weren't going to abide anymore by the unsort of written tradition, that you were going to actually have to put it into law. And the 22nd Amendment establishes that presidents cannot be elected more than twice or serve a maximum of 10 years. So you know a presidential term is 4 years, so you might be confused to how you get to that number 10. Well, the idea is that if you were vice president and you had to jump up into the presidency for some reason to fill a vacancy, that you could have at least 2 years of like fill-in time and then still get elected for two full terms of your own. But if, for example, you were a vice president and the president that was ahead of you was only president for a year and unfortunately died in office, and you had to fill in, that would be 3 years towards your 10. Then you could get elected for another full term of your own, which would be another 4, so that's 7. And then you wouldn't be able to get elected for another 4 years because that would put you above the magic number of 10. So 2 full terms or a maximum of 10 years.